Greetings and felicitations.
Hip hip hurrah, tally-ho.
Here we are, Star Pod Trek Special Issue number 3. We are systematically going through the Star Trek television series. Now we're going to talk about Where No Man Has Gone Before.
The second pilot,
Yes.
which was still a great episode.
Usually pilots didn't make it to the second one, so this Star Trek was unique in that it did. Now we're starting to see it take shape in the direction that we've come to be familiar with. This is the first appearance of Captain Kirk, second appearance of Mr. Spock.
And we have a few other familiar characters in this one, but not everybody yet. But this one has Sulu and Scotty.
Mm-hmm.
We have yet to see Uhura and McCoy.
Correct.
Or Chekhov, of course.
Yes. We also have a doctor on the ship, another doctor, Dr. Piper.
Yes, the first and only time we see him.
In fact, let's see what B. Joe Trimble's Star Trek Concordance has to say about this episode. This is a unique volume. I had it when I was younger. It actually has a dial on the front, so you dial up the episode, and it'll tell you the page number. So what does B. Joe Trimble's entry say under Where No Man Has Gone Before?
Written by Samuel A. Peoples, directed by James Goldstone. Originally aired September 22nd, 1966. Because it was not the first episode aired, it was just the pilot, but it wasn't shown first.
Correct. They started airing them out of production order, but we know that this was the second one that was filmed.
Okay, and then here's the summary. The Enterprise encounters a force field barrier at the rim of the galaxy which burns out its drives and causes marked changes in Lieutenant Commander Gary Mitchell, Kirk's closest friend. Mitchell's latent psionic abilities are accelerated until he feels only a remote connection with the human race. Dr. Elizabeth Daner, who was also affected, though to a lesser degree, takes Mitchell's side and protests when Kirk decides to exile him to Delta Vega, an uninhabited planet. After Mitchell declares that he is becoming a god and has no responsibility to humans, he escapes, taking Denner with him. Kirk follows with a phaser rifle, and Mitchell attempts to kill him with his psi powers. Daner, finally realizing that Mitchell has become, helps Kirk overpower the madman and is killed in the attempt. For the first time, Spock admits to having feelings akin to human emotions, and the episode marks the beginning of his friendship with Kirk.
Excellent. Does mention key player in there, Lieutenant Commander Gary Mitchell, actor being Gary Lockwood, and also Sally Kellerman was there as Dr. Elizabeth Denner. What did you feel about this episode when you first saw it compared to our rewatch of it recently?
I first saw it as a child. I mean, I was a lot younger, so I liked it then. It just seemed, you could tell it was different. You could tell their uniforms were different. Their tops were, the yellow and having the turtlenecks.
That's the most obvious difference, is it had a turtleneck, and there were no red shirts at this time.
Right, at least not in color, even though there were people who died in this.
So there was it was gold, blue, and then an off gold, almost going into a tannish color.
So that was one difference, and I could tell it looked like one of the earlier episodes. I remember thinking that the woman, Elizabeth Daner, I didn't really think much of her. She acted cold the whole time. Gary Mitchell was almost right about her, calling her a refrigerator unit. She just she really did seem stiff in this episode.
Mm-hmm. I could see that. A couple other things that were unique about this visually. Remember seeing it because, again, you see it out of order when it's televised, and they tend to, when they put them in reruns, they tend to loop them in somewhat sequential order. So it's jarring to see them go back to tunics that look different, but also this is the first and only time we see the phaser rifle unit.
That was something unique, and I don't know why they dropped it. I guess because it was too big and bulky, they decided not to use it again. And I believe we're supposed to assume that the hand phasers were just as powerful later on.
Mm-hmm.
I think Carl Urban in the movies looked a lot like Gary Mitchell, like he could have played Gary Mitchell if they ever wanted to use him in the movies.
Yeah, that's a good point. I could see that. I mean, that was the initial reaction, that it did look different from the other Star Treks that we come to know and love. But boy, the storyline is solid in this.
It was an excellent story, yes. Interesting that they started with the edge of the galaxy, because that's so epic. Like, whoa, it's here. This is like, I mean, definitely like they called it, where no man has gone before.
So it set the stage of the space adventure, of exploration. Let's find out about the unknown. And it tied it into some reality, now that there's a unit that they're investigating.
The ship, the Valiant, which, well, I believe they just stumbled onto that probe that had been sent from the Valiant. It's not like they were looking for it, were they?
No, but I thought it was interesting that they stumble upon something. So what was the time period?
200 years ago.
200 years ago, yeah. So that would have been 100 years from 1966, right?
Yes. So Starfleet had ships that went out that far 200 years ago, but it must have been a much slower ship that took all its time to get out there and couldn't communicate, so nobody knew what had happened to it. That's why, that's why they didn't know what had happened to it until then.
And this was a time period, obviously, where CGI wasn't in effect. Gary Lockwood and Sally Kellerman, they had to wear sparkly contact lenses, and apparently it covered the entire eyes. It was very difficult for Gary Lockwood. He could only see through the lenses by looking down while pointing his head up. So throughout the series, you will see him do that, having his head up while pointing his eyes down. That wasn't something that the director asked for, but something he needed to do in order to see.
And I think he really didn't do much walking while he had the contacts in, so that helped him a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The effects of showing him as being godlike, all it was the eyes, and then a few times that they amplified his voice, which was a good effect. And so they didn't, those were all the effects they could use back then. On a low budget show in the 60s, they couldn't do like a glowing alien or anything like that. But what they did was still powerful. It still worked.
By adjusting his voice, by showing his eyes, we got to feel that he was growing in power.
But didn't you always think that Gary, even before this happened to him, he must have been, very humorous, but also maybe very arrogant, and even though he was friends with Kirk, but you could still see some arrogance in him at the beginning.
Yeah, I thought he played the character well, and we're seeing the characterization of each individual developing right from the onset in this show.
Well, Gary Lockwood was at DragonCon a couple of years ago, and he still seemed kind of arrogant there to me, even though he was nice and friendly, and he could chat and laugh and everything. Also,
we noticed that Sulu was wearing a blue tunic.
He was in sciences, and he was in astrophysics, and I believe it's been explained that he decided to move over to become a pilot and a helmsman.
Which I like that. So we're seeing growth of character, the idea that someone could change positions in the middle of their lives. I mean, that really does happen in the real world. People make changes, people make adjustments, but they still had a reference somewhat of his interest in sciences throughout the series.
Such as an interest in botany, and he was interested in vintage weapons and things like that. Yeah, and so they added a few things to his character.
And it was interesting. Little by little, they added to his character. They didn't have to hit you over the head with it, but they showed the complexity of Sulu.
So another thing about the episode was, now everybody talks about that tombstone that Gary Mitchell created. Mm-hmm. It said James R. Kirk, and I mean, of course, this was just the first pilot with Kirk, so they probably did think that R would be his middle initial, and then sometime later they decided to say that T was his middle initial. And people have tried to come up with different explanations as to why Gary had the wrong initial in the tombstone. Someone said, well, maybe Gary didn't really know Kirk as well as he thought, or...
Well, I remember the book series, was it My Brother's Keeper?
Yes.
Right? That's where, jokingly, they said Kirk's middle name was Racquetball because he was so good at racquetball.
And I love that explanation. Yes.
So that's supposed to be the inside joke that Gary buried Captain Kirk with racquetball as his middle name.
Well, I also heard Denise and Mike Okuda talk about this at a con, because when they were doing the remastering, I believe it was So it was Michael Kuda that wanted to change it to James T. Kirk because they could change it with the remastering. But Denise said, well, we should keep it with the R just because that's classic, just because that's the episode that people remember.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was when they remastered it, they kept it with the R the way Denise thought they should do it.
Which is great that they did that. Mm-hmm. Another obvious difference with the show was that we see Scotty at the helm. That's the only time he's at the helm in the entire series. But as far as, again, we're thinking character growth and development from the early stages, that it would make sense that an engineer would want to have understanding of different stations on the ship.
And he probably knew all the different stations, too.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Spock. Yeah, we see development in Mr. Spock's uniform in this episode. He's wearing the yellow tunic, so we know he's in the command position. We're going to assume that he leaned more towards sciences going forward.
And it seems like they did say he was the science officer, though.
Another interesting tidbit of trivia was the fact that during this studio filming, there were wasp nests that were built up in the rafters. Sally Kellerman and William Shatner were both stung, and William Shatner's eyelids ended up swelling up, causing delays in filming of some of the scenes.
Oh, that's terrible. Imagine that. Yeah, and the star not being able to film for a while. And this was the pilot, and they did have, I think they still had a deadline for this, and they were still trying to get it done, even though this was made like several months before it actually aired.
Yes. And if you have eagle eyes, you'll notice that Captain Kirk did not have pointed sideburns in this episode. Later on, he would develop pointed sideburns, but this is the only time that he's seen with flat sideburns.
And what most people get out of this episode is that Gary Mitchell was the one, we think that he was the second in command, and that he was Kirk's best friend at this time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Kirk did say they were old friends. They did talk about it. So it was after that, when they made the next episode, that they decided that Spock would be the first officer.
Yes.
And actually making Spock Kirk's best friend came later. That was because Spock became such a popular character. Even though Kirk was made to be the star, he was supposed to be the most popular. But when Leonard Nimoy became the most popular, Gene had the idea, well, let's make Kirk and Spock best friends.
Mm-hmm.
That way, like, everybody that likes Spock will still like Kirk.
It makes sense. We're seeing the development of Mr. Spock's hairstyle as well. So we think about the previous episode where it was shaggy. Now it's a little bit more of a bowl cut. And as we're going to go into the next episode, it's going to be the classic Spock cut. So I think it's a good idea that they had a little bit of a transition, showing as time goes on, Spock's style adjusts differently.
He was his hair was less bushy in this than in the cage, but not quite like it was later.
Yeah.
And also his eyebrows in this were still more severe.
They sure were.
They looked more natural in the next episode.
And I like the fact that this is where, right on the onset, when they're playing chess together, Mr. Spock expresses his dual lineage, part Vulcan, part human. So we know that he's very different, and it's setting the stage. Within time, it'll explain what makes a Vulcan different than a human.
The interesting thing there was that he said it was one of his ancestors married a human, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of saying that his father married a human. And I think, the way that, it's another one of those things they probably wanted it to be one of his ancestors at the time this was written, and then later they decided, well, let's just make it where his mother was human. But to explain it within canon, most people have said that Spock just he didn't really want to reveal the truth at that time. He wasn't comfortable with saying his mother was a human.
Mm-hmm. We also see the female crew members are wearing pants.
Yes, that's right.
So we're thinking about it, what we know is canon now. So we look at Enterprise. They're wearing pants. We look at Star Trek Discovery.
The women wearing pants.
But you will see some with skirts, right, in the background, because that's an option.
A little transition. You see Nan from the Enterprise on Discovery. She is wearing the Discovery uniform, but it's the skirt version of it.
Exactly. So we're seeing that this era is more of a transition. Females have the option of wearing pants or skirts
in the time of Discovery. So then when we get to the time of Where No Man Has Gone Before, It appears that all the women are wearing pants.
That we see from this episode, yes. And we know that's going to make an adjustment within time.
It must have been a decision to make it more interesting to look at, to have the women wear the skirts, and that, after they made this pilot, they decided that all the female uniforms, they would all be those short skirts.
Totally.
Why do you think, the first pilot was rejected, but this one was accepted?
Oh, I think there's more action in this one.
Yes, that's what they wanted, was the action. The first one was more intellectual.
Mm-hmm. Where this is the happy medium. You had a story of psychics, so there was something of an area of wonder, but you had the action at the end to round everything out.
And showing off Kirk's fighting skills, which he would later do so many times.
Mm-hmm.
The fight scenes were well done on this, and also that, the scenery on the planet, the fake rocks and boulders, which also became a staple on Star Trek. So we're seeing those things in this first episode. And they did somewhat of a sequel to this in Star Trek Continues,
which was fantastic.
Yes, the very end, their 2-part episode. And they also mentioned, was it Yeoman Smith, the blonde woman, whom I had forgotten about in this episode. But she was there, and she actually did hold hands with Gary Mitchell in this episode. And so the way they continued her story in Star Trek Continues was very good. Star Trek Trivia. Question number 1. What was the name of Elizabeth Denner's father? Question number 2. What animal threw poison darts at Kirk on Demarest?
So let's talk about some of the books that feature the characters of this era, that being Gary Mitchell and Captain Kirk, especially the relationship that they had. And we'll talk about the adaptations. So first and foremost, let's talk about the James Blish adaptation that was found in Star Trek number 8. I remember reading the Star Trek Blish adaptations at my paternal grandfather's house as a kid. I very much enjoyed them, and this particular cover I remember having, because if you look at the cover, it's various shades of red. I remember taking, and the copy that I had was extremely well worn. You got it at a tag sale or something. So I ended up taking a red magic marker and coloring in the areas that were severely worn out, because I tried to retain the color red, and it kind of looks stupid.
Okay.
So that's what I remember. That's what I remember about that cover, is me trying to modify it as a kid.
So the one that we have an old copy, but it looks like a man wearing a red jumpsuit. It does look like the top part looks like a Starfleet uniform, but his pants are red. Mm-hmm. So maybe you want to get a black marker and cover it and color that part.
Yeah. Hey, what'd you think about James Blish novelization? We know that it's a condensed form.
Yes, and we know that he wrote these from the original scripts, not exactly from the episode. Now for this one, When No Man Has Gone Before, he stuck pretty close to the episode. Mm-hmm. I do think that if someone, and of course most people who read this have already seen the episode, but I think if you read this adaptation without having seen it, you would lose a lot. The script was, meant for television, so it was more visual, had more audio, such as Gary's booming voice when he used his godlike voice. I don't think that was really emphasized enough in this story, in this novelization form. Okay,
let's hear your impersonation of Gary Mitchell's godlike voice.
Where are you going, Kirk?
But what about in the show he had silver eyes?
Yes, and so the book does say that. But yeah, you don't quite.
But they added to it.
They added that his whole body became silver.
Yeah, which totally changes the mental image of what happened to him.
That part is different. Yes, that sounds like maybe they wanted to do it, because on the Next Generation they did have these glowing characters. Mm-hmm. I especially remember the one in Transfigurations where he became a character of light.
Yes,
but you could still see at first. You could see a body in human form. That's probably what they wanted to do with Gary Mitchell, but just didn't have the budget. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was mostly, it stuck pretty close to
it really
what we
did.
saw.
They did a good job with condensing it, and since it was taken from the script, we're able to see the development of the story through the lens of the script.
One thing about this, it did mention Dr. McCoy, because he wasn't mentioned on the episode because the character hadn't been created yet. But since this was written after, after he had been familiar, gotten some of the scripts for the other episodes, he knew there was a Dr. McCoy.
That's right.
So he put the reason that McCoy wasn't there is because he was just on sabbatical at this time.
And then the comic books start developing even more backstory by why Dr. McCoy wasn't there.
Yes, they said that. Well, Kirk had chosen McCoy, and it didn't say how they met in this particular comic book, but Kirk had chosen McCoy to be his chief medical surgeon, but McCoy just told him, well, I can take the job, but I still might have to leave when my daughter graduates.
Yes,
he said something
so
like
he had some family ties there. Sure. All right, next book we're going to talk about is photo novel number 2. I love photo novels.
They're fun to read. Yeah, it's like a comic book, only it has real pictures instead of drawings.
They were, at the time, extremely expensive to make. So they were more expensive than a regular novel. They had to get photographs from the show, and it's on a higher grade paper. And even the weight of photo novels, you could feel the difference between this and the standard novel.
Yes, you can tell it was more expensive to make.
Love it. And this was the closest thing that we could get to because we didn't have VCRs.
Yeah, this was the closest thing to just watching the episode, because back in the 70s when we were watching reruns, you watch it when it comes on TV, and that's it. That's the only time you get to watch it.
Yes, they never made all the episodes, only about a dozen or so, but they did make one for Where No Man Has Gone Before.
In this particular one, it started out at the beginning of the book. There's a short bio of the characters, and for the one about Gary Mitchell, it says Lieutenant Commander Gary Mitchell, 2nd officer. Oh, and it does say that Spock is 1st officer. Okay. So it says that Gary Mitchell was chief navigator, and then it says a former student of Kirk's at Starfleet Academy and a personal friend who has an unbridled interest in women. Okay, now first of all, calling him a former student of Kirk's, I don't think that's ever been mentioned before.
No.
And I would like to think they're probably both the same age and probably started the Academy at the same time as what most of fandom believes. And
the novels and comics built more off of the fact that they were contemporaries.
Yes. But the other part saying that he liked the ladies and all, you do get that from the episode. And I did kind of see him as kind of like a Riker character in that way too. The handsome guy who comes on to women all the time.
Mm-hmm. Other appearances were the original series novels Enterprise, The First Adventure, Strangers from the Sky, and the My Brother's Keeper trilogy. All great books that give us a glimpse into that era.
It's been so long since I read Enterprise and Strangers from the Sky, but yeah, I vaguely remember Gary Mitchell being in them. He was a popular enough character that he's been used before. Star Trek Trivia. Question number 1. What was the name of Elizabeth Denner's father? The answer? Gerald. Question number 2. What animal threw poison darts at Kirk on Demerys? The answer? A rodent thing. Did you get both of them right? Then you must have silver eyes.
Okay, let's talk about some comic books.
Let's do it.
X-Men number 107. This issue has nothing to do with Star Trek, but the title of it is Where No X-Man Has Gone Before. We could see the influence.
Yes, we can.
All right, so we're going to talk about Star Trek number 1, produced by IDW Comics. The cover date is September 2011. And why we're mentioning this issue as well as issue number 2 is because the Kelvin timeline in the comics world started asking the question, what if the Kelvin universe characters started having the adventures of the original series? How would they react? How would it play out?
Okay, yes.
And so let's talk about this. It is number 1, written by Mike Johnson, artist Stephen Molnar. I really like the art in here. I mean, they end up getting the characters' faces correct. Everyone really looks like the actors.
I think they had to do that, though, just so that people wouldn't get them mixed up with the original series characters.
Sure, that was the goal.
Yeah, they want it clear that these are the Kelvin characters.
Yes, and they did a good job with the facial characteristics. So they condensed the story of Where No Man Has Gone Before, added some flair of the Kelvin timeline, and adjusted some things. So pretty much a retelling of Where No Man Has Gone Before.
But this one did not have Elizabeth Daner, right? It mentioned her just by name, but that's it. Like, and then she's not actually in it. They decided to leave her out.
I think getting comic artists to draw real people, with a few exceptions, I think it's hard to get them to draw them like the actors. Because
comic artists can usually make up their own faces and things.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I thought they did a great job of making the Kelvin timeline Spock. I mean, he looked just like the actor.
They had to get artists who could do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Some did better than others. Another comic we're going to talk about, DC Comics Annual from 1991. So actually, we're going through them in somewhat of a timeline because that's how we read it. We tried to read it in chronological order, not the order that they were released, but what the story pace would be. From the early stages, we did the Kelvin timeline retelling, and now we're in the prime timeline. This is Star Trek Annual number 2 from 1991, entitled First Time Anywhere, Kirk's Days at Starfleet Academy. Love this artwork on the cover. Jerome K. Moore is one of my favorite of all-time cover artists, along with Brian Boland. I mean, those are my top two. If you want to talk about an artist that can capture perfect likenesses of real people, it's Jerome K. Moore.
It is a beautiful cover, and the idea was great, showing Captain Kirk in these different eras, and Admiral Kirk, all of the incarnations of Kirk in his different uniforms and everything.
Mm-hmm. The story was by Peter David, art by James W. Fry, Kirk Swan, and Aaron Starr. And so since we're doing a backward story, we're doing something retro from Kirk's past, him at the Academy. I thought it was fantastic to have the epitome of 1960s Superman artists, Kurt Swan, draw it.
Yeah, that was good too. But the story though was this one was a really good story by Peter David. This is
probably my favorite out of the whole stack.
I mean, yeah, Peter David just knows the characters so well. And so the way he did Kirk in this one was such a different take because he was he started out at the Academy and he didn't fit in. He didn't like it. Mm-hmm. He was made fun of. Well, and of course Finnegan was there.
Because he was so studious. Do you remember the line?
Yes.
Do you remember the line in the episode that Kirk was known as a stack of books with legs?
Yes.
And so they took that and said, we're going to make Kirk character very studious. And he was frustrated with his other classmates that weren't taking it seriously.
And another thing was that even though Kirk wasn't doing well, he was, I guess we're supposed to think he was writing letters to his parents. But,
yes.
But he was telling his parents, "Oh, I'm having a great time here," and all of that.
You got the idea he didn't want to disappoint them.
Right.
One of my favorites out of the stack that we had a chance to reread. How about Star Trek from DC Comics? Volume 2, number 73 and 74, No-Win Scenario and Crossroads. It was written by Howard Weinstein, Rachel Ketchum as the penciler, Mark Hike as the inker. What I liked about this time that we're talking about Kirk during his Academy days, we get to see his relationship with
Carol Marcus.
What did you think about this series?
That was a good series, too. So this one showed how Kirk handled the no-win scenario, because we know that he changed the conditions of the test. And so that was just...
changed conditions meaning?
Meaning he cheated, which he admits.
Mm-hmm. Well, it shows how he did that and why he did that.
And that was a good story, too. Yeah, he didn't believe it was a fair test, just like Savick said. This was not a fair test. And yeah, interesting, because in Wrath of Khan, Kirk didn't... I mean, he didn't tell Saavik, well, that's how I felt about it too. He just said, well, now you have something new to think about.
Yes. And the ties with Gary Mitchell. So we see that throughout the Academy, he and Gary Mitchell had ties. Okay, Star Trek Annual number 1. This is from Volume 1 of the DC Comics series by Mike W. Barr, David Ross, and Bob Smith. The First Mission. So these comics that we've been reading talked about them in the Academy. Finally, they are going into space.
So this has Kirk and Mitchell serving on the same ship.
Yes.
And showing more of how their friendship developed.
Well, we're seeing with this issue the transition from Captain Pike being on the Enterprise and moving into Captain Kirk. We're seeing Lieutenant Uhura, what she had to give up to be on the Enterprise.
That's right. She had a relationship, and then when she was called to be on the Enterprise, she just had to do that to further her career, because that's what was most important to her. And also, it was in this one where Pike was trying to do the Vulcan salute to Spock, and he couldn't quite do it, and he said, I guess I speak it with an accent. And that, I recall, was... I mean, the writer of this comic must have gotten that from a true story that I heard Leonard Nimoy tell, where one of his fans tried to do the Vulcan salute, and the fan just couldn't do it, and he said, I speak it with an accent. So, I mean, a great little story there that someone threw in.
Totally. Star Trek Volume 2, issue number 64, where one man has gone before. This is written by Kevin J. Ryan, penciler Rod Wingham, and Arn Starr. This is where they're on the rodent planet,
which was mentioned in Where No Man Has Gone Before. It was like one line where Gary Mitchell said, remember on planet Demerys were the rodent creatures, and I took a dart for you.
Yes.
And so now we have the whole story of how that happened.
I absolutely, this is why I love Star Trek so much, because yes, the series is wonderful, but the expanded universe makes it even better.
Because the expanded universe, it was written by fans. I mean, even though it's still official, it still has to be approved by the powers that be. But it's also something that, like, they try to do what they can to make it tie into what we already know, and they expand on it. And they usually do it beautifully, because they do it with love, just the way, as much as we love to read it, they love doing this.
These artists and writers, they express how much they love Star Trek. And so these are love letters from them. Star Trek Volume 2, number 76, No Mercy, No Justice, No Escape. This is pretty much the last comic story that we see, featuring Gary Mitchell and the rest of the Star Trek crew from that era, going onto a planet, trying to escape capture. But here's the crown jewel. This is a series that I say, if you haven't read Star Trek comics, there's a few ones that everyone should read. This is one of the series. They are produced by IDW, and they are photo montages. So it's very much like the photo novels. I mean, they call them fumettis. They call them, I mean, it's John Byrne's. It's a photo montage and story by John Byrne. And because John Byrne absolutely loves Star Trek, and he expresses how much time it takes and how much effort it takes. And if we look at the back, this is entitled Star Trek Strange New World. And he goes into the back talking about how photo novels were all the rage in the 70s. And it wasn't just Star Trek that had photo novels. There were other movies that were producing photo novels. It was very expensive to make. It was very difficult to sell once Laserdiscs started becoming popular, and within time, VCRs. So it's really a lost art form. But what John Byrne does is he wraps up the whole storyline with Gary Mitchell.
So this one it's made like a comic book, but all of the pictures are not hand drawn. They are pictures that are from the episodes. And they're redressed. I mean, sometimes they just take characters and put them in a different background, but it all looks like photographs, and it has the balloons like comic books have. And so in this particular story, it's written like a sequel to Where No Man Has Gone Before. It has Kirk and the Enterprise going back to Delta Vega, and they find out that Gary Mitchell his spirit is still alive. They find it like the dead body is there. Elizabeth Daner's body is still there, but Gary Mitchell in spirit form still exists. And this was just a beautiful story of Kirk going back and seeing his best friend for the last time.
And we think about it, this was a one-shot for Gary Mitchell on that show. And in reviewing all these publications, we see that there was a lot to take out of that episode. There
was. I mean, but we thought that he died on the planet, and so this was a great way to explain, just to see him again and see what might have happened to him. Because if he was a god, then yeah, I mean, maybe he didn't die.
Yeah, great way to wrap up our viewing of Where No Man Has Gone Before.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.